The courtroom in Santa Ana, California, buzzed with the low hum of whispered conversations. Judge Margaret Wells, a woman with decades of experience in the legal system, adjusted her reading glasses, tapping her fingers absent-mindedly on the polished wood of the bench. The cases she presided over seemed to blur together. It was just another day, just another face. Her sharp gaze scanned the room, but it wasn't a man like Lawrence Walker who commanded her attention. Lawrence, dressed in a well-tailored suit, stood at the defendant's table. He was a black man in his late 40s, confident, poised, and impeccably dressed. His appearance would have commanded respect under normal circumstances, but in Judge Wells' courtroom, it didn't matter. She barely looked up from the stack of papers in front of her, more interested in the notes she was scribbling than in the defendant standing before her. "Mr. Walker," she began, her voice dripping with condescension. "Let me guess. This is all just one big misunderstanding, right? Or perhaps the justice system has it out for you?" A few chuckles rippled through the gallery, and the burly bailiff, who had worked with Wells for years, allowed a small smirk to tug at his lips. Even the young prosecutor, Emily Hart, couldn't quite hide the small curve that appeared on her face as she focused intently on her notes. Lawrence didn't flinch. He stood motionless, as if he'd been through this countless times before. He allowed the laughter to fade before responding, his voice steady. "Your Honor," he began calmly, "if you read the case file, you'll understand I'm not the defendant here. In fact, I'm the one who brought this case to your court." The room went silent. Judge Wells' eyebrows shot up, and the smirk faded from her lips as she looked over her glasses. "What did you say?" Her voice was now a sharp edge, her attention finally focused entirely on Lawrence. Lawrence tilted his head slightly, his tone unshaken. "I'm not the defendant. I'm the one who brought the case to this court." His words hung in the air for a moment, but the judge didn't immediately respond. Instead, she flipped through the case files before her with deliberate care. "Then why are you standing at the defendant's table?" she asked, her voice tight. Lawrence didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket, his calm demeanor unbroken. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed, and the bailiff shifted his stance, a subtle but telling movement. Judge Wells' eyes narrowed too, instinctively, as she watched Lawrence's hand. When Lawrence pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet, everything changed. He flipped it open, and under the fluorescent courtroom lights, the polished gold emblem inside gleamed brightly, a U.S. Secret Service badge. The shift in the room was instantaneous. The light-hearted atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a thick, palpable tension. The gallery fell silent, and even the bailiff, who had been a silent accomplice to Wells for years, took a subtle step back, his hand instinctively hovering near his sidearm. Judge Wells stared, her lips parted in disbelief. Her eyes flicked back and forth between Lawrence's face and the badge, as if trying to make sense of the situation. A stunned silence filled the room, the laughter and mockery from earlier now entirely absent. The prosecutor, Emily Hart, stiffened, her eyes darting between the judge and Lawrence. The room seemed to hold its breath. Lawrence didn't move, keeping the badge visible just long enough for everyone in the room to see. Then, with deliberate calm, he slid it back into his pocket and spoke again, his voice unwavering. "I've been working undercover, investigating corruption in this court system," he said, the words cutting through the air. "And Judge Wells, your name has come up more than once." Judge Wells' breath caught, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the pressure of the situation weighing on her. This wasn't a case she could dismiss with a wave of her hand. Her grip on the gavel tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she tried to maintain her composure, her eyes flicking nervously to the papers in front of her. Her usual confidence was gone. Judge Wells exhaled slowly, trying to regain control of the situation. For years, she had ruled this courtroom with an iron fist. Her decisions were final, and those who stood before her either complied or faced the consequences. But now, in the face of this revelation, she wasn't sure what to do. The confident, mocking attitude she had held on to so tightly was slipping away, and the weight of Lawrence's words had planted a seed of doubt that was growing with each passing second. Lawrence, meanwhile, remained calm. He didn't move a muscle, his gaze fixed on the judge, waiting for her to process what he had just said. His job was far from over. The investigation wasn't just about exposing one corrupt judge. It was about taking down an entire network of judicial corruption that had been festering under the surface for years. Wells, it seemed, was only the beginning. The room was silent, save for the sound of the air conditioning humming softly in the background. The prosecutor, Emily Hart, had stopped taking notes. Her pen lay still on the table, but her mind was racing, processing the weight of what had just happened. For the first time, she wasn't sure which side she was on. She had spent her career building her reputation under Judge Wells' authority, but now she was witnessing something she never thought possible: the fall of a judge she had once admired. The bailiff shifted his weight, and for the first time in years, he looked uncertain. The gallery, once amused by the judge's smugness, was now dead silent, the realization that something monumental was happening slowly sinking in. Judge Wells finally regained enough composure to speak, though her voice lacked the usual bite. "This is preposterous," she scoffed, trying to dismiss the whole situation. "You're grasping at straws. There's no proof, no concrete evidence, just speculation." Lawrence didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his suit pocket once more and pulled out a folded document. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and placed the document on the bench in front of her. The room was so quiet that the sound of the paper unfolding seemed loud in the silence. The weight of what he was offering was undeniable. Judge Wells hesitated before picking up the document, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the letterhead, then moved to the signature at the bottom. The Department of Justice, an active investigation. Her name listed among several others. Her throat tightened. This wasn't a bluff. This wasn't a game. It was real. And the room was watching as she came to grips with the reality that she was no longer in control. For the first time in decades, she felt vulnerable. As she scanned the document, her eyes widened. The carefully crafted image she had maintained for years, a respected judge above reproach, was crumbling before her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, to dismiss the charges, to try to salvage something, but the words wouldn't come. The gravity of the situation was too much. All the power she once held in this room seemed to evaporate in an instant. Behind her, the prosecutor, Emily Hart, had turned pale. She sat still, her pen now abandoned. She had no intention of going down with Wells, and the realization was settling in. She had backed the wrong side for far too long. The bailiff's radio crackled at his hip, and his hands twitched, though he didn't make any moves. His loyalty to Wells had always been unquestioned, but now that loyalty was clearly wavering. And Lawrence? He was waiting. He stood, unwavering, watching as the weight of the truth settled in around him. There was no need for theatrics, no need to gloat. His job was done. The pieces were in motion, and the wheels of justice were finally turning. Judge Wells opened her mouth again, but the words still didn't come. She had nothing left to say. The gavel, once the symbol of her authority, lay abandoned on the bench, silent and useless. The room was now filled with an uneasy silence. Judge Wells sat frozen at the bench, her hands trembling slightly as she held the document Lawrence had presented her. Her once unshakable composure had crumbled, and she seemed at a loss for what to do next. The air in the courtroom had thickened, the tension palpable. No one spoke, but the weight of the moment was heavy in the room. Lawrence's voice broke the silence, as calm as ever. "For the last 6 months," he said, his gaze never leaving the judge, "my team and I have been investigating judicial corruption in Orange County. We've gathered evidence of bribes, unlawful sentencing, and collusion with private prison executives." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "But most importantly, we've found a disturbing pattern of disproportionately harsh rulings against Black defendants." Judge Wells, still reeling, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She was a seasoned professional, someone who had spent decades making life-altering decisions from behind that very bench. But none of her experience had prepared her for this moment. Her hands hovered over the gavel, but she made no move to strike it. In her mind, she was already calculating the next move, how to dismiss this, how to regain control. But deep down, she knew it wasn't going to be that simple. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Some of the people in the room, many of them regulars who had witnessed Wells' ruthless grip on power over the years, exchanged stunned glances. They had always known something was off, but to see this unfold before them was surreal. It was as if the very foundation of the courtroom was shaking, threatening to collapse under the weight of what Lawrence had just revealed. Judge Wells let out a brittle laugh, a sound that seemed forced and hollow. "This is absurd," she scoffed, attempting to regain her authority. "Are you trying to make a mockery of this court? What you've presented here is nothing but a collection of cherry-picked cases, some twisted narrative designed to discredit me." But Lawrence wasn't swayed. His expression remained neutral, unfazed by her words. He had known this would be her reaction. He knew the system, knew how those in power tried to protect themselves. He reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out another document, one that appeared official, sealed with the mark of the federal government. He stepped forward and placed it on the bench in front of Judge Wells. The room watched in tense silence as she hesitated for a moment, her fingers now gripping the edge of the document. It was as if she was trying to avoid facing the inevitable, but there was no escaping it now. Slowly, she unfolded the new document, her eyes scanning the letterhead and the signature at the bottom. It was a formal notification from the Department of Justice, confirming an ongoing investigation. Her name was listed among several others, her involvement in a network of corruption laid bare. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't a smear campaign. This was real, and it was happening in front of her. The whispers from the gallery grew louder now, and her mind raced to process what was unfolding. She couldn't deny it. Her name had come up in a federal investigation. Her thoughts scrambled for a moment, looking for a way out, a way to spin this back in her favor. But nothing came. She felt the walls of the courtroom closing in on her, the gavel before her now a symbol of her own impending downfall. For the first time in her career, Judge Wells wasn't in control. The system she had manipulated for so long was now turning against her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. In the gallery, the spectators had fallen silent. The mood had shifted dramatically, from amusement and skepticism to stunned disbelief. Some of them, who had been quick to laugh at Lawrence's initial revelation, were now watching with a mixture of awe and fear. They had never seen anything like this. A judge, once untouchable, now facing public exposure and federal charges. And in the midst of it all stood Lawrence Walker, steady and composed. He had done his part. The evidence was clear, the investigation was in motion, and the system was finally starting to correct itself. He wasn't here for revenge or personal gain. This was about justice, about holding the powerful accountable for their actions. And Judge Wells, for all her authority, was no exception. The prosecutor, Emily Hart, who had been sitting quietly through all of this, finally looked up from her notes. Her expression was unreadable, but inside her mind was racing. She had built her career under Wells' influence, and now she was left to wonder how much of that was built on corruption. How many cases had she pushed for? How many rulings had she defended, knowing now that the very system they had worked within was tainted? As Emily glanced over at Lawrence, she could no longer pretend to be neutral. The truth was undeniable. Judge Wells was guilty, and there was no turning back. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and thick. The weight of the documents on the bench seemed to grow with each passing second, and Judge Wells sat frozen, her eyes darting back and forth between them, unable to grasp what was happening. For the first time in her life, she felt completely powerless. The walls of her carefully constructed world were crumbling, and she couldn't stop it. She had always believed she was untouchable, that no one could question her authority, no one could challenge her. She had ruled this courtroom with an iron fist for years, making decisions that altered the lives of countless individuals. But now, as the courtroom watched in the stunned silence, the gavel, her symbol of power, seemed meaningless. Lawrence stood at the defendant's table, unmoving, watching her every reaction. His task wasn't to take her down for personal gain, it was about restoring justice. For too long, people like Wells had abused their power, and today that abuse was being exposed for the world to see. But Lawrence knew this wasn't the end of the story. There was more to uncover, more to expose, and the investigation was far from over. His eyes never left Wells as the tension in the room grew. The prosecutor, Emily Hart, seemed almost paralyzed by the weight of what had unfolded. She couldn't look at the judge, and she couldn't meet Lawrence's gaze either. Her mind was a whirlwind, trying to reconcile the woman she had worked with for so long with the reality now unfolding before her. Wells' hand clenched around the gavel, her knuckles white. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. The power she had once held in this room was slipping through her fingers, and all she could do was watch as it crumbled. That was when the door at the back of the courtroom swung open, and 2 federal marshals entered. The atmosphere in the room shifted in an instant. The air became charged with anticipation, the finality of their arrival clear to everyone present. The first marshal, a tall woman with cropped brown hair, stepped forward. Her expression was professional, but there was a certain weight to her presence that made even the most hardened individuals in the courtroom sit up straighter. "Judge Wells," the marshal said, her voice firm but not unkind, "please step down. You are under arrest." The words, though expected, hit like a sledgehammer. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The bailiff, who had spent years working alongside Judge Wells, shifted nervously. His once rigid posture now seemed uncertain. Emily Hart, still motionless at the prosecutor's table, looked down at her hands, a chill running through her. For so long she had admired the judge's decisiveness, her ability to control the room, but now all of that power was gone. Wells' eyes flicked toward the prosecutor, then to the bailiff, but neither of them made any move to support her. They too had understood the gravity of the situation. The system had spoken, and it wasn't on her side. She turned to the marshals, her face pale, searching for a sign of resistance, but there was none. They weren't here to negotiate, they were here to escort her out. Her fingers tightened around the gavel one last time, almost as if she believed she could wield it to reverse everything, but the moment passed. She couldn't bring herself to strike it. Slowly, reluctantly, Wells rose from her seat. The gavel remained abandoned on the bench, a symbol of her loss of control. As she stood, her gaze swept across the courtroom, looking for someone, anyone, who might intervene. But no one did. The marshals stepped forward, one on each side, and began to guide her toward the exit. The gallery, once a silent witness to her authority, now watched in disbelief as the woman who had once ruled over them was led away like any other criminal. The room was alive with hushed whispers, some incredulous, others filled with a quiet satisfaction. They had witnessed the fall of a powerful figure. They had witnessed justice in action. As Wells was escorted out, the gallery's murmurs grew louder, the air filled with an undercurrent of recognition, of the realization that power unchecked could and would eventually fall. Judge Wells had ruled with a harsh hand for far too long, but in the end, justice had found a way to reach her, no matter how high she had climbed. Lawrence remained standing, his eyes fixed on the empty bench where Judge Wells had once sat. This was not just about her, this was about something larger. The investigation wasn't over. Wells was just the first domino to fall. He turned to look at Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Whitaker, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines. Their eyes met for a moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The investigation had just begun, and Judge Wells' removal was only the start. There were still many more people to hold accountable, many more corrupt officials to expose. "Stay vigilant," Lawrence said quietly, his voice steady. "This is only the beginning." Whitaker nodded, a grim smile on his face. "We'll be in touch," he said. As the door to the courtroom closed behind Judge Wells, the silence hung in the air for a moment longer, the room slowly returning to its former state. But now it felt different. The balance had shifted, and everyone in that room knew it. Outside the courthouse, the bright California sun beat down, casting long shadows on the ground. A small crowd had gathered, and reporters stood with microphones, eager to capture the latest developments. Camera crews adjusted their lenses, but Lawrence wasn't interested in the media circus. He had done his job, and the spotlight was the last thing on his mind. He adjusted his suit, exhaling slowly. The weight of the day had yet to fully sink in, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a win for him, it was a win for the system, for justice. The scales had tipped in favor of accountability, even if just for a moment. Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Whitaker caught up with him, his expression one of exhaustion, yet something else, satisfaction. "We've got enough to push for a full trial," Whitaker said. "The evidence we've collected is airtight." Lawrence nodded, his mind already focused on the next steps. "Good. It's not over. Cartwright was just the beginning. There are more out there who need to be exposed. Whitaker gave him a dry chuckle. You're right. We could use more people like you. Lawrence didn't respond, his thoughts drifting to the many lives affected by the corruption in the system. For years, those in power had operated with impunity, destroying lives, all while believing no one was watching. But today, that belief had been shattered. As Whitaker walked away to address the press, Lawrence turned and headed into the city, his figure disappearing into the crowd. The fight wasn't over, and it would never be. But today, for once, justice had prevailed. In the end, the most important thing wasn't the headlines or the accolades. It was the message that had been sent. Power unchecked was dangerous, and those who thought they were untouchable would eventually face the truth.